Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Mystery Bible on Podcast. We're so excited about this episode today because you have four co-hosts. You have myself, Joel, and the Fearless Trifecta, including Brian and Dan. And then we have a special guest host that I'm very excited about, my good friend, Michael Kimelman. You may not be familiar with Michael Kimelman, depending on your background and what you like to read or the conferences you like to attend. But Michael is an expert in many things, especially finance. He has a background in running hedge funds of certain notoriety. He has published the book Confessions of a Wall Street Insider, which is a lot of fun, an exciting book, and also a very sobering book that I highly recommend. He's also co-authored Mastering the Basics of Cryptocurrency. Mr. Kimelman is a guest speaker, a coach. He's been featured on CNBC and other places like that. I'll give him a chance to explain some of these things in a moment. But most of all, I wanted him on here because he's an outside-the-box thinker and he has a great perspective on finance. Some of you know that I, Joel, when I'm not teaching and preaching, I actually make my living in finance and have for many years, running a small niche hedge fund and a lot of private transactions. My background is in investment banking and private equity. Michael and I actually first got to know each other at a conference in Dubai that was around the blockchain and cryptocurrency space, and we had a lot of fun philosophizing and diving into some deeper, more complex topics. And I think we both believe that there is a lot of overlap between finance and theology and worldview and these important topics. The reason why we wanted to bring Michael on in particular was because I think it's important for you, our dear listeners and our dear audience, to understand some perspective of what's happening out there. I think most of you know that the world is changing very rapidly. We've done episodes on artificial intelligence. We've done episodes on some of the interesting tech and social developments, obviously how some of the very ancient documents and prophecies and things that we have discussed, how they apply today and are showing up in really interesting and in some cases alarming ways. And we're going to be talking more and more about the global financial system and the global governance system. And we wanted Michael to help give some perspective on that because he's a consummate expert. He writes a newsletter. We will put some links to his website and some of his content so you can follow him separately from this podcast. So with all that being said, again, myself, Brian, Dan, and our good friend Michael Kimelman. Mr. Kimelman, go ahead and take the mic for a moment and describe yourself, what you think our audience should know. And then I want this to be kind of a free form stream of consciousness, Q&A, but most of all, I want you to feel unleashed to say the things that I know are floating around in your mind and that you've been trying to say through your newsletters on what is going on out there and what is the state of the world and what should the average person be paying attention to as finance develops and changes in strange and sometimes sinister ways these days. Sure. And thank you, Joel, Brian, and Dan. Great to be here. I would say, and I'm always not very good at this. Let me start off. It's always better when somebody else describes me. There's a degree of immodesty, it feels like, whenever you're talking about yourself. And I try to maintain some humility and humbleness. But in the interest of just delivering information, I would describe myself as somebody who has lived several lives. And that's can be good, can be bad. I think we all go through extreme highs and lows these days. I don't know anybody that hasn't had their share of trials and tribulations. Mine just happened to be a little bit more public than most people's. So in my first life, I was raised in Los Angeles. I went to law school, did very well, worked for one of the top law firms in New York as an M&A associate, did, multi-billion-dollar deals with them. And it was around the late 1990s. And if you recall, everybody was having a lot more fun in either finance or technology. It was the dot-com bubble. It was great booming market indices. So I lateraled over to finance and worked for several different hedge funds, worked my way up from a trader to a portfolio manager to eventually running my own hedge fund. And at the peak of what we'll call running that hedge fund, the great financial crisis occurred, which is one of the words they use to describe that extreme period from 2007, really 2008 to 2009, when the financial world just collapsed. And as part of that,
the hedge fund I was running did very well. We got up to about $250 million in assets. We were positioned properly. One of my core characteristics is a skeptic. I like to differentiate skepticism from cynicism. I tend to be a skeptic that maintains a positive outlook, but even with that positive outlook, it was clear that we were in really uncharted waters and that a lot of really bad decisions that all of these old institutions had made, including the Federal Reserve, including our politicians, were now coming back to haunt us during that 2008, 2009 period. And we were properly positioned short banks and short a lot of other lenders and companies that did poorly. So we did well, but the bookend of that was a surprise, which was the FBI kicking in my door. And we can talk much more about that later. I was arrested as part of an insider trading case. The partner that I had hired to come over and be one of the partners at my hedge fund had worked for a gentleman named Raj Rajaratnam, who was one of the biggest tech investors out there. He ran the Galleon hedge fund. For those that are familiar with finance, it was a $7 billion tech fund. He was considered the best tech investor on earth. It turned out he was talking to some people he shouldn't have been talking to, as was my future partner. And as part of that, I was arrested as a conspiracy to commit insider trading and was offered a very simple deal after that, which was, hey, the government did a little bit more follow-up and said, we realize you're a very peripheral part of this case, which is, in my mind, their way of admitting that it was a weak case and I probably shouldn't have been arrested. But my resume made me very attractive working for one of the big law firms. Their thesis was I was pumping my old law firm, contacts and partners for information. That was completely untrue. Really, what I did was play a fifth-hand tip from my partner, which was in finance, people are constantly giving you ideas. I played something like 287 ideas from him over a 3-year period. And on this one idea, the government proved that he had inside information and said I should have known better, and was originally arrested over that $16,000 trade, which,
$16,000 on a $250 million portfolio. It's not exactly a needle moving trade.
No. And when I, read the complaint, I didn't think it could be true. And the the funny part is when you're arrested, you get arraigned and they arrange bail if you have the ability to make bail. And even the bail agent and the probation agent were like, we have to check with prosecution. There's a mistake in the complaint. It says $16,000. And of course they went through it and it came back and it was really $16,000. So either way, once they did a little more work, they said, we realize you're a peripheral player. We're going to offer you a very sweetheart deal. Take a plea for 1 count of conspiracy, not actual insider trading, but conspiracy to commit insider trading. And if you take that plea, you'll get no jail time and you'll pay no fines and just get out of the case. We don't want you here. And this was a time that I was, for lack of a better term, abusing alcohol. I was certainly drinking too much in that Wall Street lifestyle of you go out after the market closes and have a few drinks. And then post my arrest, those few drinks a night became 6, 7, 8 drinks a night. And it became 7 days a week. So I'd like to think in retrospect, with 10 years or 14 years behind me, I might have made a different decision. But again, things happen for a reason. And I chose not to take that deal. I didn't think I was guilty, didn't think I had done anything wrong, was stubborn. Genetically, I'm stubborn. If you meet my father or my grandfather, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But really wanted to look myself in the mirror and be able to look my kids in the mirror and say, this was not a proper case. I should not have been arrested. And I'm not going to plead guilty to something that I didn't do. And the funny thing is, I was a lawyer. I went to law school, practiced law, had taken all these constitutional classes about presumed innocence and due process, and the burden of proof is on the prosecutor. And then once you actually go through the criminal justice system, you really see firsthand what I think many minorities, unfortunately, have known for many years now, that the criminal justice system is far from justice. It's far from truth. There's very little objectivity. And there's a reason the feds win 97% of their cases. I mean, in any type of neutral, objective, or fair playing field or sporting event, if one team won 97% of the time, you'd look at that metric and say, look, maybe this is not aligned fairly. But I don't want to sound like I'm complaining or anything else. I knew those odds going in and thought I could beat them and could not. It was the height of the financial crisis. We were tried right down the street from Zuccotti Park with, if you guys remember, that was the Occupy Wall Street movement. They were literally throwing, blood on people walking into Wall Street buildings. I was walking into the courtroom, being booed and in the press and Wall Street Journal, New York Post, described as an arch criminal. All this in reality we were proper scapegoats, I'll say. If you broke the law, sure, you should be punished. But you're talking about, in my case, a few $1,000s. Even in Raj and my partner's case, you're talking about a couple of $1 million. Meanwhile, the big Wall Street banks and commercial banks paid fines of $400 billion for fraud, and not a single person went to prison as part of that.
What I want to highlight here, because I think this is important for our audience, and I think that the moral of this story, to some extent, is that there's the interest out there in the justice system is not necessarily justice, and I'm not saying that in a cynical way. It's more of, you learn the hard way how things really work. And what you learned was that when the federal government comes after you, your choices are go to jail on a moral high horse, or say sorry and pay the fine and accept whatever label they put on you and deal with it for the rest of your life. And the reason I'm putting that out there is because this happens a lot more than people think. And in talking with you and in reading some of what you've written, I think at the time you had the audacity to believe that the system was actually designed to do one thing, when the reality was the system was designed to extract money and build careers. And I don't want to say that in a way that is just throwing the whole thing under the bus. I recall it just very, very quickly, anecdotally, I remember the day when I was in the military when I realized that everybody in charge of me was just trying not to get fired. And I remember like when the weight of that descended on me, because my whole life I had been told like, oh, this is this prestigious system. It's built on all these principles. And I'm not saying that anti-military. I realized the day when I realized it's all people in there. And all these people ultimately have their own self-interests at the core. And once in a while, you can find somebody who's willing to go against their self-interest for what's right. But systematically, that is not the norm, even though you're taught that in school and you're told that that's how the justice system works. So in this case, you were accused of something that you could morally and with a clean conscience say, I didn't do the thing that you're saying I did, and I'm going to fight it on the sake of right and wrong. And what you learned was, the system doesn't reward that kind of putting a moral stake in the ground.
Yes. And it really is a good example of just incentives. I mean, like you said, people are fallible. So whether it's their own self-interest or their own faults, it doesn't always lead to this aggregation of people that is part of a system, part of an institution. It doesn't always lead to good outcomes when those incentives are so perverse. And the incentives are, like you said, if the prosecutors don't win, their careers are finished. So they tend to do anything they can to get wins. And sometimes that includes trampling on, the Constitution. It includes not delivering exculpatory evidence to defendants, all types of things. But I don't want to, like you said, I don't want to trample on it either. With the blessing of, some years and thinking about this, I was far from innocent. I believe I was not guilty from a legal analysis for sure, but I put myself in the purview and nearby people who weren't exactly honest or integral people. And I knew that. And I figured, hey, I can keep my distance. I run a separate book from my partner. I run a separate book from the guy who's telling me, you should be involved here. What does his actions have to do with me? And that was, of course, a very naive approach, which I've learned, since then, that when you have a partnership, when you have a relationship, when you have, whether it's a marriage, a friendship, a business arrangement, you are your brother's keeper. You are responsible for the people that you surround yourself with. And if somebody's not acting properly or not a good person, you can't then say, all right, well, I'm not going to worry about it because I'm over here. When a grenade blows up, it doesn't just kill the person that was holding the grenade. It kills anybody around him, or at least wounds them. And I was certainly wounded. I shouldn't have been anywhere near these people. And frankly, was greedy. I thought they could make me money. I thought they were, doing things that I had seen for my entire career on Wall Street. Didn't think there was anything untoward about it or wrong about it. I mean, that was the way the system was set up. You played other people's ideas, you played other people's rumors and tips. It was on TV. There were websites geared towards it. And the feds just hadn't prosecuted this or even pretended that it was wrong for something like 20 years. I think if you remember, and you're probably old enough, Michael Milken and Ivan Boesky and those guys in 1987 were like the last real insider trading cases that were brought.
And Michael Milken's done extremely well on that.
Yes.
He spent his time in prison, came out, and made an absolute fortune since then.
Absolutely.
And is one of the wealthier guys out there.
He got less of a sentence than I did, I think, for $580 million. So,
and that's important that ultimately you fought with the federal government and you went to prison.
Yes, and I did. And again, in some ways, it was the most incredible blessing I've ever been given. It certainly woke me up to a completely different world that I didn't know existed. I lived in this fantasy world of when you open up the New York Post and see somebody accused of something, it was, oh, he's guilty. Oh, he's definitely guilty in this. And then once you go through that system, you start reading things a little bit closer. You start reading, whether it's government documents closer or media reports, because I read the media reports about me and they were wrong about everything. I mean, from where I worked to what I did to who I knew. And so it was classic, Gelman amnesia effect, where if you read something that you really are familiar with and see how poorly written and researched and printed the media is, and then go read another article about something you don't know and instantly then believe, oh, that's got to be true. This was a huge wake-up call about everything, about, government integrity, about the FBI. I was awakened very early to some of the corruption and whatnot that we see today in the political investigations and whatnot, because I saw, agents turning off wiretaps and doing all types of things and, basically fudging warrant applications and whatnot, and saw them get away with all of it and thought that's really not how it's supposed to work, I thought. So it was a huge wake-up call. And not only that, it was a personal blessing in some ways. First of all, it was incredibly traumatic, and I'm happy to talk about that as well. But what it did that was positive was it got me sober. So it went, I went from drinking, like I said, 7 or 8 drinks a night, being foggy mentally, not being the best spouse, father, or anything else I could be, trading at like a 40% function and efficiency even. So this got me sober. I saw people who were at the absolute bottom of society that had nothing, who were still good people. I saw people who were at the bottom of society who couldn't control their impulses and would never contribute to society. So I saw all types of people from all types of walks, and was able to get out and reprioritize my focus and really become the best father I could become, which I think I was a very good father before, but I think, it really reorchestrated what I wanted to focus on. And that was my children when I got out. So I know I took a huge tangent there and went off track of what I do in lives. And I'll just sum it up really quickly and we can come back to anything you want. After that, I was, of course, banned from society. This is like 2013, 2014. So when you have a record, especially a white collar record, you can't get a job at Goldman Sachs. Back then, every application was, do you have a record? I couldn't get a bank account, a credit card, couldn't even get a lease. Had to, put my brother's name on a rental contract because I couldn't rent an apartment as a 42-year-old, male. And so I ended up finding a space or 2 spaces where there were a lot of, call it anarcho-capitalists and libertarians and people with track records that weren't traditional. And that was the entertainment industry and of course the cryptocurrency and Bitcoin space. And that's where I've spent a lot of my time since.
Well, I really appreciate, all of that history and your candor and all of that. So that's good to hear and get a little bit of an insight into a small snapshot of, distilled down of years and years of things going on. So,
well, and I think it's a really valuable story for our audience, and I think of your story frequently. So it's valuable to me because one of the things that it teaches people is there's this fantasy out there of, okay, if you're here or there, or if you've achieved this or that, then you've made it. That's the golden thing. And running a hedge fund on Wall Street is absolutely one of those places where, okay, if you're here, you've made it. And what people don't realize in many cases is it is a fantasy. It's not reality, and it's not the most important thing. And the people there doing those things are people, and they have problems. It's same thing with Hollywood and these other high profile, highly successful, highly compensated, the world of the beautiful people or the masters of the universe or whatever cliche you want to put on it. At the end of the day, it's the main things that matter, which is your children, your spouse, your integrity, and so there's a shift of perspective that I think is very valuable, that I think has really trickled through into your outlook, Mike, and the way you see the world and the way you think about things, and the incredible luxury of realizing the world lies to you. And I don't mean that in a cynical way. We don't want everybody walking out of here just being suspicious and negative about everything. That's absolutely not the point. But what we do want is an increase in wisdom and understanding that when you pick up the newspaper, you got to think about what's the agenda and the motivation here. Or when you see a criminal case, especially these days, and we don't get really much into politics here, but just recognizing people are building their careers off of this stuff. They're not really that interested in what's right and wrong. They're trying to get career and engagement and all these other sorts of things. And again, I got an early taste of that being at the Air Force Academy at a time when it was just embroiled in scandal, and realizing none of this has anything to do with what I actually live with every day. But Barbara Walters can go on TV and say whatever she wants, and then I walk out down the street and get yelled at by people because I'm in a uniform that she just said is represents terrible people. And that was a very interesting reality to come by at age 18 and go, oh, they don't really care about me as a person. This is about somebody getting headlines, and I'm the refuse on the side. I'm the collateral damage, and I think your story in a bigger and much higher stakes way is similar. That somebody somewhere had to build their career. Somebody somewhere had to get the headline. You fought against people who aren't interested in whether you were right. They're just interested in whether or not they win, and they won. And that was a valuable lesson, and it shaped the way you look at the systems and the way you approach reality and the world. So I'll stop there. Brian or Dan, if you have anything, I'll let you jump in, and then we can kind of direct some of the more current things that I have in mind.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, again, you're talking about these different striations of the world. Most of us are not in those quote unquote rarefied atmospheres. And if you get involved with the court, it's local, and it's much more straightforward. It is kind of what it is, even if it's a criminal case. But when you get into these large scale federal prosecutions, it's a completely different ball of wax. No one in Colorado Springs who's dealing with some sort of a custody case or a minor criminal thing, there's no one trying to make their careers off that anyone would really care about. You know what I mean? And so getting to see behind the curtain, because the media presentation of all those things is completely generally false, and you have to wait years later for people to write books that can tell the real story about what happened before you understand anything. Because if you just pay attention to the media narrative, you're not even going to get anything reasonable or accurate. So that's about all I had to say about that. Just a little, opinion.
Good stuff, Brian. Dan, anything you want to throw in? I know you haven't had a chance to have the mic yet, and I know you're not. You and I have talked a little bit about this, so I know a little bit where you're at. But anything you want to clarify or ask, Mike, before we jump into some of the current events?
No, nothing right now. I just appreciate you sharing, Mike, and the open honest, you know.
And let me just say thank you. To Brian's point, it is a very different story. A state case versus a federal case, versus an IRS case. In a federal case, I mean, you walk in and it's the United States versus Mike Kimelman. And I consider myself a patriot. I love my country. I may not love my government, but certainly love the country and the opportunity it's afforded me. Both my parents and grandparents were veterans and fought in Vietnam and World War II. And to see that is devastating. To hear it's devastating. And then to see, the prosecutors have the flag lapels on their suits. There's a huge eagle behind the judge. The judge is a former prosecutor. He's very much on the prosecution's team, and just every single thing optically from the time you walk in is, this is the good people, the baseball apple pie and the veterans against this very bad person. And it's a very tough thing to overcome. Again, it sort of opened my eyes for how that entire system works and how certain people, again, I'm what I consider a person of privilege. I unfortunately spent, 7 figures to defend myself and still lost, but had money to defend myself, was at least educated enough to understand, my defense in the system and what I was going up against. And, you could read it in the book. We had a crazy judge in some ways who got the law wrong and got overturned in every other case after mine. But I had already served, justice is slow. I served my time, and it wasn't a huge amount of time. It was 15 months in Lewisburg Federal Prison, which, again, I used to read in the paper, oh, he only got a year, big deal. That's until you go away for a year, or I think 6 months is probably enough to learn your lesson in general. But one thing I did notice, when I came out, it was 42, 43 years old. I went from being an 8-figure net worth and thinking I had everything in the world with a beautiful wife, big house, 3 healthy children, adequate money, and realizing I really had nothing because I was so spiritually and emotionally and personally bankrupt. And then also just losing that, realized what the real priorities and perspective was. But I started over at 43, 44 with, the shirt on my back and millions of dollars in debt after this, and was able to rebuild myself, which I'm very proud of, not for just having it done it for myself, but to be the model for my children, to show them that, hey, we all get hit in the face in life, and it's really not what happens to you, but how you react to it, that I could be that model for them and be there for them. And we all have a terrific relationship now, the highest priority in my life. And despite going through a difficult divorce, I have a new person in my life. It's not that new. She's been with me for about 5 years now, that we'll be getting married. So all good things eventually, after going through this really difficult trough. And I want to say the most illuminating part of that trough was in prison. Again, I was considered a skid bid because I got 15 months is what they called it. But I was with people who had 25-year sentences, kids at 18, African-American, Hispanics that were drug lookouts or had, been in possession. And the drug laws were really draconian back then, and they still are. So some of these kids got 10 years, then you had a firearm, that's another 10, or 5. And they had signed off on pleas to avoid life sentences that were just astronomical, 15, 20 years. And I didn't understand how these people could be so not blasé, but just, and not positive, but willing to, like, stoic about their sentence. If you're an 18-year-old and you go in for a 25-year sentence, and I'm meeting you 15 years into that 25-year sentence, and you're calm and stoic and positive and know you'll get out and are building your spirit and your intellect for when you get out to contribute to society. I mean, I think that's nothing short of a miracle. And I didn't understand it. And I didn't really understand Christianity, having grown up in New York and LA and been part of finance, if I'd ever said God or Jesus or any of those words in my previous life, I probably would have been fired or at least looked at as if I was insane. I mean, finance and law are very, this is only what's in front of you. It's very rational and logic, and we don't deal with those other things and don't bring them up. But they asked me to sit in on some of the Christian Bible study and worship sessions, and I did, and I was blown away by the faith and the hope and the spirit that it enabled these gentlemen to deal with some of life's harshest consequences that have ever been delivered or dished out, and to do it in a really unbelievable and faithful and positive spiritual way. And that blew me away. I had never, seen anything like that in my former religious, spiritual, philosophical life. So I just wanted to make that point before we moved on, because it did change my life. It may have taken 5-10 years for me to digest that on my spirit walk and faith walk, but it blew me away.
I remember, I think we were in the Burj Khalifa at some event, and up on the 4th or 40th or 400th or whatever floor it was of that building, and we were having there was a group conversation going on, and somebody was saying, and I don't remember who, but I believe you were there. Somebody was saying, I don't even know what's real anymore. What's real? What is the thing that really matters? And we, it was a down moment, so we had a chance to talk about it. And I remember saying something along the lines of, well, I know when I get home and my little 4-year-old daughter runs up to the door and jumps up in my arms and puts her arms around my neck, I know that's real. And it sprungboard into this very interesting conversation with a lot of very interesting people, because we started discussing what's real out there, because the 8-figure net worth, that's not real. That's a thing. It's a number. It's a made up number, and it can be exchanged to some extent for goods and services also, which are not real, just, in terms of the lasting permanence that we're talking about. And so what you're describing is you saw people who were facing real trial and real suffering, and had something real that they were holding on to that seemed to be making a real difference compared to the smoke and mirrors and facades and illusions of finance and in some cases, unfortunately, of justice. And it's a powerful thing to learn, and it's a very hard thing to learn because it requires a shattering of all these things that we're told. And I want to move a little bit to that conversation of what are we told versus what's really going on. And I want to take that framework that we discussed earlier of small local versus large macro. So shifting to just a pure economic concept. On a small local level, somebody can walk into their credit union and say, I understand how my credit union works. And the average person probably thinks they have some understanding of how their local bank, how their credit union works, how they make money, the spread of lending money versus the deposits and what they pay. And they know there's some leverage and some multiplier effect there. But then you step out to the macro level, and I've tried to explain this to people, and a lot of people don't believe that that's not really how it works on a macro level. That when you have an international banking concept that's lending money, say, to a despotic third world nation, they're not looking to make money on the interest. That's not the point. There's an entirely different system in place, and it has a lot to do with reputation and facade and careers being built, and ultimately these bailouts of these very, very, very large numbers that happen. And I think you alluded to it earlier when you said, look, I am up against the United States for a $16,000 deal where other people are paying not an order of magnitude, but orders of magnitudes more than that just in fines. I want to just serve that mess to you and say, what is going on? What is the deal with that? How do you have Michael Kimelman facing prison over a $16,000 trade versus somebody else who's paying $400 billion in fines? And when you were telling your story, I'm not sure if you know Fabrice Tour. He's a friend of mine.
Mm-hmm.
He was a great guy, really sharp guy, a lot of fun to be around, brilliant mind. But he was the guy who basically was served on a platter to Capitol Hill for Goldman for the mortgage-backed security situation. Probably around the same time you're going through his stuff, he was trying to explain to Congress people what a mortgage-backed security is, and in his wonderful French accent wasn't doing him any favors at the time. And I got to talk with him about that whole thing, and we had a great gut laugh over the real story of what was going on there. And ultimately, similarly, he had to go under the bus to get to and had to differently than you, but somebody somewhere had to suffer publicly for the sins of this broader group of people, so that everybody could move on and say, hey, we cleaned that up, let's move along. But it wasn't really cleaned up, and nothing really changed. And if anything, the things that got us there are being done 10 times the extent here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's exactly the point of that book that we have read in the past, right? The Monster of Jekyll Island.
Yeah, Creature from Jekyll
Island. It shows
you
the Creature of Jekyll Island. It shows you in depth and in detail how certain people get thrown to the wolves that aren't considered to be the most important people in the whole process. It's purely for public show. It's a theater. So we can get this person, they can go down. Everybody in the media says, oh, look, the responsible party got punished and justice has been served and everything is right with the world. And the reality is that the real, group of people that are behind various things, I don't care if it's SNL or, the savings and loan crisis or different kinds of banking interests, and all of the things that go on with the banking itself, with the way money's transferred and money created out of thin air and all those different things. It's like, yeah, you get prosecuted and thrown in jail for 15 months of your life for $16,000. And then the injustice of all of the rulings the judge made were all overturned later in cases. That's when you're just like, seriously? It's crazy. And, when like President Biden just with a stroke of a pen said, okay, everybody who's only in prison for a marijuana possession charge is now out. And that was hardly anyone, because they never just charge you with one thing. They're going to charge you with 10 things, or they're just not going to go to court. And so all those people are still in prison, even though maybe they had some minor infractions that are now legal in 38 states. So it's just crazy. But that's an observation from somebody who didn't have to go to prison yet.
Yeah. No, I mean, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, it's just the quip that comes to mind, and then I know you've got plenty to say here, Mike, is anybody who believes that we have evolved beyond human sacrifice isn't paying attention, because our society loves a good old-fashioned human sacrifice. We love nothing more than to build up. It's the Mayan system where we love to put somebody on a pedestal, throw all the accolades at them, build them up, and then right when they get to that apex, publicly rip the heart out and say, look at what we have here. And then everybody somehow feels this great cleansing and we move on. But what I want to get to is when they do those public things, when they put, whether it's you or Fabrice or anybody else, and I'm not trying to I'm not trying to turn you into a martyr. I'm just trying to point out that there's the public, high profile, but ultimately kind of useless process that goes on. What is it that they're not wanting everybody to be paying attention to? And what's going on today in the financial system that is not being talked about that really should be the story?
Yeah. I don't think it's just today. I think it's, as you guys mentioned, it's sort of since the beginning of time. There's always been that sacrifice or scapegoat or something that lets you avoid looking at the intrinsic institution or structure as being corrupt and saying it was a bad apple. It was a few bad apples and it's not the underlying system. In our case, it's the underlying system, unfortunately. But politics and the way human nature is, you're never going to have people that are in power investigate themselves or point themselves out or do something that's against their interests. So we're sort of left with this system as long as there's not real accountability or objectivity or truth, you're left with this system that sort of carves off, it's like a tree pruning. So you get rid of a few branches on the end or a few leaves, but the underlying tree is corrupt and cancerous and rotting. And until you really find a new system and replant that tree or fix it, you're just going to keep kicking the can down the road, which is what we've been doing now for God knows how long. Certainly, at least for the last 50 years. Of course, the speed with which we've covered it up and kicked it down the road has been accelerating in the last 20 years or so. And I think, the Fed made a very big mistake in the early 2000s in overreacting to what was probably just going to be a simple cleansing. I mean, the beautiful part about free markets, if you believe in them, and capitalism, if it's not crony capitalism, is that you have booms and busts. You have up and down cycles, and during up cycles, capital goes sometimes to a place it's not supposed to go, but certain companies may sprout from it and grow, and others may, not deserve that capital and get it. So when there's a downturn, you have that pruning. You have companies that weren't run properly going out of business, and either their employees or their capital or their products being absorbed by other companies. And you have that downturn. And unfortunately, we've systematically done everything we can since at least 1998, and probably a little bit earlier as well, to really mute any type of pain or any type of downturn in the economy. So what you've gotten is all these just bubbles that have built up in the economy, in finance, all this inefficient capital that's been allocated to different structures and segments and companies and people, and all these things that just should have gone out of business that haven't. And that makes for a really junky, for lack of a better word, economy and financial system. And what we're trying to do now is see how long we could really just extend it until either, and I'm not sure what the end game is, if there's a real end game from a humanitarian perspective, it's you're sort of waiting until technology perhaps throws a Hail Mary and catches up enough to fix some of these underlying faults. If you're not, then there's going to have to be some type of reboot or adjustment at some time. And unfortunately, this is one of those things where it could have been painful back in 2000 or 2001, but we kept muting any type of pain and building up the inefficiency. So now it's probably system threatening if you were to allow real pain to come in. So I'm not sure where that goes, but I know there's certain paths that are more likely than not of where we end up. And I know it should have allowed pain to take place in the early 2000s and throughout, and the great financial crisis. And we could have been in a much stronger, better place right now. But, I think it's an underlying, sometimes the economy is a reflection of the underlying culture. I'm one of the few people, I think, on Wall Street that believes culture and politics, especially geopolitics, leads markets, whereas most people just look at, its earnings and its GDP growth, and that's all we need to know, along with interest rates and a few other things. And sure, that's, short term, maybe even intermediate term, but in the long run, I think culture and politics and other things, psychology, determine where markets go and where capital goes. And we've become a society that does everything it can to avoid pain. It's whether it's the antidepressants, whether it's alcohol, whether it's just, not dealing with reality. We can't have pain anymore in our society. And that's leaked through to the economy and underlying financial system. And now we're in a position where there's going to be some serious pain. I don't know when. It's, I sort of feel like we're in a 6 month to 6 year. And I know that's not a really great time frame, but I think we'll see some considerable pain in that time and some big changes in the underlying financial system.
Dan, I think you had a comment. I saw your mic going off mute there.
Yeah. So, I've thought for several years that we were due for some collapse, and it keeps on not happening. And so I keep on being wrong. But, just like a person who keeps ignoring their pain and not getting it addressed, is going to have a catastrophic end at some point. And so, you just mentioned, like, we systematically avoid pain in the financial system. And that doesn't mean that the things that are causing the pain are getting better. And we just keep on masking it. And so, what do you see as the range of possibilities? Is there, there's talk about soft landing, there's catastrophic endings. So what kind of things do you see as possibilities over the next 6 months to 6 years?
Yeah, I mean, for some reason that 2030 time frame before then keeps coming back to me, and I don't know if that's a function of the WEF Great Reset 2030 or some of the 2032, whether it's Mayan or other calendars that like that date, or Ray Kurzweil's transhumanist. By then we should be something else entirely, part machine, part human.
Or some beautiful collision of all of the above.
Exactly. But there's just several big factors. I think if you had nothing else but the economy, you just have such an incredible amount of debt and dead capital that have been built up into companies and bid up. I mean, if you think the great financial crisis happened from really 2008 because Greenspan kept rates low in 2003 and 4, for maybe an extra year and a half to 2 years, rates were below where they should have been. And that built up a real estate bubble. That bubble cracked in 2008, in The Big Short, great movie book to see how that happened. And you saw that we almost lost the entire financial system, but for unprecedented, government and Fed interference and bailouts. Well, post 2011 and 12, we've had that now for 9 years, right up to COVID. And then COVID, we did something else entirely that was even greater than the great financial crisis as far as money that was pumped in to salvage the system. So, think about the amount of bad zombie debt and capital that have been built up over that 10-year period compared to the 2-year period where we got the great financial crisis. So I think they understand. And by they, I mean, it's a combination of the Fed, of the Treasury, of the politicians, the lifetime politicians, whether it's deep state, these administrative people that have been there forever, and the intelligence community. They understand that it's not sustainable. But like you said, they're going to keep stretching it out as far as possible. And I think we've gotten a really different look over the last 3-4 years where they're playing with certain elements of control to be able to transition to some other type of system that enables a very small number of people to control a very large number of people. I mean, if you look back to feudal times or anywhere else, you would often need a massive standing army to control, maybe 5 people for every 1 soldier. Here, between, digital passports, social credit, control of the financial system, locking people out of the internet and everything else, Operation Choke Point, you name it, and different other structures, whether they're health-based, financial-based, or otherwise, you can have a handful of people control, 500 million people, 1 billion people. So it's a very different system of control that they're playing with now. I think that's very much a test case or they're beta testing. And I don't think they're sure how long this will last. One of the great things we have going for us as Americans is, we're the best boat in a really crappy Navy. All of the other countries' problems are worse than ours. And we also have some real built-in advantages from energy. If we wanted to be, we could be energy sufficient. Food, we could feed our entire population if we wanted to. Just here, we're surrounded by 2 oceans. So we are geographically, militarily very tough to attack. And we also have the biggest military in the world. I mean, we spend, 10x, 20x more than anybody else combined on our military, which will have to change soon based on certain things we can talk about. But so we have tremendous built-in advantages that will give us extra time compared to an Argentina that has, 120% inflation, or China that has to feed 1 billion people with no natural food or energy. Like, there are huge disadvantages other people have, but there are still structural issues with the U.S. that have to be resolved. And like you said, one of those things is we've had low inflation for 30 years because of technology, because of outsourcing to China and elsewhere. Now that that has ended, either due to supply chain, failure, or COVID, or just, China moving up, that's something that has to be dealt with, because you can't just print money completely, unabashedly anymore. You have to worry about the inflation that goes with the printing of money. So you get into this vicious cycle. And this is, I don't want to lose listeners, but when you have interest rates at 5, 6, 7%, and you have to refinance the $30 trillion in debt we've built up, and that's just the debt that's in front of our face. There's also other liabilities from Medicare and
that's
pensions.
just the balance sheet debt versus the versus the obligations.
100%. You've probably close to 150 in obligations trillion, but 30 plus on the balance sheet. You're adding $2 trillion a year to that, because we still don't even, spend nearly less than the money we take in. So we're running an annual deficit of 1 to 2 trillion and up. And to refinance that debt, I mean, think about it like a house or a car. If at 2.5%, you can refinance that debt, it's only going to cost you maybe $600 billion a year. If you're going to refinance that debt at 7, 8%, whatever that number is, you're talking about 3 times that amount. That's going to eat up all of the discretionary spending that we have. So you're going to have to start cutting, Medicare, Social Security, military spending, everything else. It puts you in a very difficult position. And I don't think we'll do that. I think we'll, try to keep spending and spending and spending and let inflation run hot. But that becomes a vicious cycle, because then bonds have to stay high because people aren't being compensated at 3% when you've got 5% inflation or 4% inflation. Bonds have to be up there. Nobody wants to buy the bonds because they're not really being compensated. So the Fed has to buy bonds. And then you get in this vicious cycle where, in order to buy those bonds, the Fed prints its own money, and that further devalues the dollar, further leads to inflation. So there's really no way out of it at this point, other than trying to kick the can and hoping technology bails us out, or having a huge reboot, which, at some point may be necessary.
So a question I have is how long? So part of the issue, and again, my suspicion is this just buys more time. It doesn't solve anything.
Right.
But that is the GDP. The fact that for the last 50 years, our GDP was sitting at 4% or so growth rate, sometimes closer to 5%. And right now, over the last couple of terms of the presidency, it's been like 1.5%.
Yep.
So then it's in line with Europe and, the other Western powers, whereas before we were always this engine. And there are people that are saying you can grow your way out of some of these issues if you have enough capital infusion that's actually wealth building instead of just paper transfers and not real money. Then you could actually, solve some of these issues if you can keep that engine sustained for long enough. But like I said, I suspect that, that'll help for a while and it'll look good for optics right now, but it's not going to solve any issues. Is that?
Yes. I mean, the underlying story of this all is that all of our institutions have become very corrupt or incompetent. And I think we saw that with COVID flat out. I mean, if you had asked me before COVID about the CDC, from movies and everywhere else, you'd think these are these guys in these white lab suits that are the smartest scientists in the world. They have an $8 billion, $10 billion, annual budget. Like, anything happens with Ebola, they're in Africa in 3 seconds and keep it there and nothing happens. And it turned out they were some of the most, incompetent and fooled people that exist. And their one job they had was to stop something like COVID. And in reality, they made it 1,000 times worse due to their incompetence. And it's not just, personal incompetence, it's structural incompetence. We're just slow. None of our systems are capable of keeping up. They're not geared even towards competency. They're geared towards extraction these days and self-enrichment. And that's what you're seeing. People call it late stage capitalism. They call it whatever they want to call it. But the last 4 or 5 years, it's become really obvious in politics and elsewhere that people are governing not for the good of the people. They're governing for themselves. They're enriching themselves. Their level of extraction is getting greater and greater. And it's become a pure power game. It's not, hey, historically, under precedent, under law, under, faith, this is what's right. It's how can I enrich myself and my friends and keep that appearance and keep our media, covering that. So it's a deep entrenched corruption that has to be dealt with and solved. And, fortunately, what you're seeing in some ways are emergent networks based on technology, based on different ways that groups can get together, but they still don't have the tools of the state or of the government that can fix some of these really big issues. So at this point, and I think Joel might agree, or most libertarians might agree, is the best we can do for the last 20, 25 years is just get the government out of the way and let natural capital markets, free markets, Adam Smith's invisible hand, let people, even working in their best self-interest, not be burdened by ridiculous government regulations or other things. Sorry about that. And solve our own problems. Because if the government got out of the way with some of these things, we'd be able to solve them. But it's also very late for that, considering all of the interference that we're getting these days from a corrupt media, from corrupt government, from just crony capitalism. We don't have free markets and whatnot. We've got close to it compared to anywhere else in the world, which is why I think that even with rates spiking like they have, and even with some of the stuff we saw in COVID, that the economy has managed to be much more resilient than anybody would have imagined. And I do think that is a testament to whatever free markets we still do have, because capital goes where it's welcomed and it can adjust very quickly, even to incredibly difficult circumstances. But we're going to see over the next few years, and we can return, I think you guys had a comment, we can return to some of the changes that we're going to see that are going to exacerbate a lot of these issues and possibly help us, but also possibly condemn us to a very different system as well.
Well, one thing that I wanted your comment on too is the other movement that's happening in capital markets, like through BlackRock and some of the other ones, which is stakeholder capitalism and ESGs. And what's happening where they're penalizing the West and then taking the same contracts and making China do them, while they're imposing draconian government regulations on carbon emissions and this, that, and the other to stop us from doing energy production and all these things. And then they just give these contracts to, PetroChina or somebody else with no regulation whatsoever. So they're trading relatively clean fossil fuel energy, for example, for the dirtiest fossil fuel in the world. And there's a lot of that going on behind the scenes, and I've only recently become aware of it myself. So if you have any thoughts or comments on that, or is some of that even more of a red herring? Like, is it just kind of in the noise with the overall corruption of the system and not really a big deal in and of itself?
Well, and I'm going to throw in before you answer that, Mike, the reason that is such a big deal that many people that the average 401k holder at home doesn't realize is these systems that Brian's describing, these the ESG requirements and some of these others, are being imposed on American finance, and these are not elected representative-based systems. These are coming from global centralized authorities that are not elected by the American people, that are telling us, and this sounds extremely nationalist, but this is a reality. They're saying, no, you have to do it this way, you have to value it this way, or else you won't get this contract or you won't get this valuation. And I've dealt with this very practically in my day-to-day, where I've been working on projects with household name hedge funds and wealth management groups. And they've said, if it doesn't check this box and that box, we can't do it because we won't get the valuation and we'll get punished for it in the market. And when you really drill down to, well, where is that coming from? Well, it's not coming from the Fed. It's not coming from the SEC. It's not coming from your elected representatives. It's coming from somewhere else.
Yeah. And I think there's two big problems. One, you're not looking at capitalism anymore when you have that. You're not looking in stakeholder capitalism or ESG or whatever you want to call it. Previously, it was return on capital. So you're just trying to get the best return on capital possible. With this stuff, there are other elements that come into the equation, and return on capital may be minimized, but if you check this box, as you mentioned, you'll get points. And frankly, that doesn't work in free markets or capitalism. You want people to get the best returns. That's why they're giving their money to money managers. And then they can, as it comes downstream back to them, choose to allocate that capital as they wish, whether it's for, if they want to buy a Prius or if they want to buy a gas guzzling, Ford F-150, whatever it is. But the government is not supposed to dictate those things. And it's not even the government, as you mentioned, it's all these supranational authorities and other things. But the issue with it, too, is it's all corrupt as well. So you have things like Tesla, which is the biggest electric car company in the world, along with BYD in China, getting a lower score than ExxonMobil, which is fossil fuels and all the things they tell us are so bad, which really aren't. And that's a whole different story. I mean, oil and fossil fuels are still the most dense energy out there. We have no chance of having solar or wind or any of these alternative fuels replace fossil fuels anytime soon. And even if it is in a couple decades, it's going to cost, anywhere from 100 to 150 trillion dollars, which we don't have. So it's a little bit fantasy, but I think I can cut through a lot of the mess in the interest of time. And of course, this is a much deeper conversation, but ESG is just communism. And I hate using labels, but it's really just communism. It's geared towards controlling companies and people to get an outcome that person wants, which is really control. And it's control over that person's money. It's control over that person's activities. And now they're using carbon or, climate change or global warming or whatever term they want to call it, environmental, in order to control that person. So go ahead.
Let me just make this super practical because some people may not know what it is. So ESG is environmental, social, governmental. And essentially what you have is a centralized, unelected global authority that is deciding different companies and different transactions, different efforts, scores on these basis of this kind of vague moral conception of how it should look based on somebody's idea of what the outcome should be. And that scoring system and that labeling of morality on these transactions and on these companies is having a very real world practical effect on their ability to get stuff done, get transactions done, and have appropriate valuations. So what you have in the case that Mike explained, Tesla has a lower ESG score than ExxonMobil. And the whole point of ESG is supposed to be scoring the environmental friendliness and the benefit of any given companies or transactions. How are we making the world a better place? The issue is there's the people who are deciding this are not necessarily held to high account on how these decisions are made. And there are billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars at stake for these decisions. And so ESG is this weird label that gets thrown around, and everybody is suddenly in finance, and international finance in particular, is suddenly having to abide by these things. And nobody's 100% sure what it is or how it works or where it comes from. But if you get it wrong, you're going to be punished. And if you get it right, you're going to be rewarded. And the arbitrators of who's wrong and who's right are pretty foggy when it comes to how these decisions are made, so it's just rife for corruption.
Well, Michael mentioned communism, but
yes.
It's not just communism, because every dictatorial system that we know of, they always do what's called nationalizing business. Nazi Germany was great, did the same thing, right? Mussolini's Italy, you've got Tojo, Spain, everybody, they did the same thing. They take free market enterprise companies, and then they take government control over those companies. And then they create this unholy alliance where people that, well, especially in dictatorial situations, they weren't elected, they took over. And now they're making all these decisions, and they're trying to use the work that's being generated by these companies for their own purposes, whatever those purposes are. And so it's for sure communism and plus, but it's also happening within these systems where money is being redirected because how many businesses in the United States now, large scale businesses, are actually nationalized? They're actually run by the government. GM is the old prime example, right? When they became Government Motors instead of General Motors. And there's a bunch
or run
of other
by
ones as
proxy.
well.
If your board is
Yeah.
controlled by 2 or 3 of the same companies for every single major strategic company, if BlackRock is electing the board,
Right.
it's putting the board seats on literally every single major strategic company, and nobody's entirely sure who's behind it. Or Vanguard is another one. It's very, very hard to figure out who's actually making these governance decisions. But I guarantee you, Mr. Listener at home, if you open up your 401k and look at the largest mutual funds and go look at the largest holdings of those mutual funds and go look at who owns those holdings, you're going to see BlackRock and Vanguard and 1 or 2 others every single time across the board with no exception. So who are these people and what are they doing? And Mike, I want to get back to something you said earlier of, well, our best hope is for government to get out of the way so that the pain can come and it can collapse. The things that need to collapse can collapse and the markets can reward and reallocate. And I agree with you philosophically that would work. It's kind of like saying this system has gone on a very surprisingly long time on first 7 drinks a night and then 8 and now 12. And now they're throwing in some ketamine and some weed to help manage it. And everybody's going, wow, it hasn't collapsed yet. This is great. We're still going up and to the right and still feeling pretty good. And everybody's going, well, we kind of feel like this is unsustainable. And so your to take the analogy, an inappropriate step further is you're kind of saying, well, if we went cold turkey, then we could solve a lot of this stuff. The issue is I don't see a lot of incentive for these the powers that be wanting to get out of the way, and in fact, quite the opposite. And so, practically, if somebody says, "Well, Joel, do you believe that's going to happen?" I say, "No, absolutely not. I don't believe it's going to happen. I believe that we're going to go completely the opposite direction." And that's what you were hinting at earlier of a consolidation of control and consolidation of authority. And I want to give you kind of as much leash as you want, and recognizing that speculation is speculation on what is that and what does that actually look like. So let's say we get to 2030 and the government hasn't gotten out of the way. What are we dealing with? And the reason why I'm asking, and I'm sure you're not surprised, is a lot of what we deal with here on the Mr. Bible On podcast are these concepts of the end of the age. What are we facing? And you have this 2,000-year-old document throughout the Bible, and then also in Revelation, where it describes in eerie detail a hyper-consolidated global governmental authority at the end. And whether that's this time or the next time around or 500 years from now, it seems like we're moving towards some and I'm not trying to say, hey, Mike Kimelman thinks we're at the end of the age. I don't want to put that on you. But if the government doesn't get out of the way and goes the other direction, and we get to 2030 or 2040, and we have a system that has collapsed conveniently into consolidated control instead of distributed control, what are we dealing with here? What is the average listener at home who has a few young kids at home and a 401k and is just trying to make their house payments and have a place to live and get their groceries? How does that look different in 10 years? Because I think we have the sneaking sensation that it's going to be very, very different, and it's probably changing faster than it ever has before. And the groundwork for those changes are being laid. And you and I, in our day-to-day, are encountering that in alarming ways. And ESG is one of them. And there are many others. And when I tell the average consumer, hey, the Federal Reserve is neither federal nor a reserve, right? and people go, wait, what? Yeah, I mean, just simple stuff like that, because nobody tells them. So this is your chance to tell people, what is it we're dealing with, and what is it we're really facing, and how could this look if these things don't get corrected? Or if I'm so cynical to say, when they're not corrected, what are we going to be up against by 2030?
Yeah, and I think there's really, and you framed it very well, I think there's 2 constructs that you have to think about. The first would be, the most ideal would be a return to, call it America First principles and constitutional principles and freedom, and really having much more of a decentralized system where people, divorce money from the state and people can have more of a sovereign existence. And that will naturally lead to recovery and productivity and blossoming. I think would be beautiful. And again, I'm giving it a 30-second treatment versus the hour, 2-hour treatment it deserves. But I think that's also very unlikely.
We're not trending that way.
Yes.
And in fact, we're accelerating to trend the other direction.
Yes. And the other direction, and I think this is a really helpful lens to look at everything that happens today, from financial to political to social, is that the government realizes it's unsustainable. they don't want to give up power or control. You've always had a rules for thee versus rules for me type system. So whether that's, in the context of the climate change and carbon emissions, you have John Kerry, the climate czar, flying around on a private jet everywhere, but telling you have to eat bugs and have to drive a bicycle to work. So whatever we're talking about is not going to affect those 1,000 top families or the top 0.1%. It's really for the bottom 90%. And, the service sort of 10% in between, maybe a bit of a hybrid. But what the government wants and what we're moving towards is a fully centralized control system that is based on CBDCs, meaning central bank digital currencies, based on verifiable, biometric identity, which can't be changed, and which is based on absolute control of health through digital passports and whatnot, through identity. And so that you don't have the ability to independently, as you think you do now, even you don't necessarily have that ability either to independently access your money. Bank of America or anybody else, JP Morgan, can turn that switch in a heartbeat, but you at least have the appearance of being able to access your money. A central bank digital currency tied to your ID and a health passport will control in a social credit score manner, similar to what China has, every aspect of your life. So as long as you're the good citizen or the good subject, and you have a car that doesn't use much gas, you're allotted your 20 miles a week, you're allotted your daily or monthly helping of meat, as long as you're not posting the wrong things on Twitter or Facebook, as long as you're a very good obedient subject, you'll be allowed to exist, and it will be a much less wealthy existence. You'll be given probably, we're moving towards UBI, and that's in the context not just of AI. And UBI, for those that don't know, it's universal basic income, some type of social welfare where instead of you get a specific type of welfare or money for something, everybody is just given a certain amount. So it removes the stigma somewhat. And it's a number of, call it 1,000, 2,000 a month, whatever it is. And everybody gets that, which is, again, much closer to socialism or communism. But everybody will be under that yoke. You won't be allowed to protest the government. Free speech will be a thing of the past. Yep.
Let me just throw a layer on what you just said, because I think it's important for people to realize, because they say, what are you talking, universal basic income? Why would that ever be necessary? What? The reason why something like that is necessary is because we are rapidly moving into, and I haven't heard another term for it, the one I use is the age of irrelevance for the average citizen. So in the past, if there was a highly centralized authority, think feudal Europe or something like that, then what the person in charge needed was a large labor force and a large military. And that required a lot of bodies. You need a lot of people who are willing to march into battle and a lot of people who are willing to do hard labor, whether it's in the fields or in the factory or wherever else. You need a lot of people to do that. Well, today we have a huge population, but we also are rapidly moving into the full automation of those tasks. You don't, even the way we fight wars now, any soldier will tell you, is increasingly consolidating into information and automation. And instead of having large armies conflicting on battlefields, you have extremely small, extremely specialized forces doing 95% of the combat in a lot of cases. Similarly, when it comes to manufacturing and hard labor, especially with artificial intelligence, but also just the improvement of technology, that's not something people need to do anymore. It's something that's getting automated. So what are you left with? Well, if you're the guy in charge, and if you're a centralized authority over one of these populations, then you somehow have to manage a very large population, 90% of whom don't have anything necessarily to add, meaning there's not enough education or expertise for that average person to be able to feed into that highly automated, highly technologically advanced system. And there's not enough need for bodies on the battlefield. So as long as we've got that, then how do you keep that population from becoming completely restless and turning into, riotous anarchy? Well, you give them a basic income and you meet the basic needs and you say, be quiet or else. So that's what Mike's describing, that universal basic income concept, where you have all the assets belong to a centralized authority. And going back to that inflationary scenario you're describing, Mike, that's a very real scenario, because when you have inflation, it doesn't hit everybody proportionally in the same ways. The people who have the assets benefit from inflation, and increasingly that's a very small number of people who are benefiting from inflation because their assets become increasingly valuable. And the people who don't own assets are hurt by inflation because those assets become more and more and more expensive and more out of reach as income doesn't keep up. So you have this, that the gap in society widens and widens and widens. Inflation is essentially a tax on people who don't own assets. It sucks the wealth out of the bottom 90th or 95th or 99th percentile, depending on who you ask, and consolidates it with that 1, 5, or 10th percentile who does own all the assets. And suddenly everybody looks up and goes, why can't I afford everything? And why is everything on an as a service basis? And how come I need so much government support just to meet my basic needs? So fast forwarding all that to what Mike's describing of a centralized authority, where the vast majority of the population is on a universal basic income that is allocated based on behavior. And this is a reality in some parts of the world, by the way. And it's all on a digital currency. And that digital currency is tied directly to biometrics. And Mike, we have not talked about a WorldCoin or altcoin yet on this. So you're welcome to comment on that. And that this is not pie in the sky. This stuff exists and is being made today. I just want to give people that context of this is what we're talking about.
I wanted to throw a couple comments in there. There's several countries in the world already that have universal basic income. The United States has already debated it. Finland has debated it. Canada's debated it. Brazil's debated it. Like, this is a thing that some small European countries already have it, like I said. The funny thing, and this is, obviously Michael has a lot of experience in the cryptocurrency world. I am a computer guy, and I'm also an encryption expert. So I don't trust cryptocurrencies very much because of how easy they are to get hacked, which has happened over and over and over again. But the whole point of them was to make a decentralized financial model that was not controlled centrally. And so then we talk about central bank controlled digital currencies. It's literally the opposite of what they're made to do in the first place. But that's what people want. They're like, well, cryptocurrencies are risky. So if I can get a bank to back it up, well, that's not risk anymore. It's like, you haven't done anything. It's still a bank. So anyway, you comment on that stuff. Just throw that out there. That's one of my pet peeves, I guess.
Yeah. That's the big difference between a CBDC and something like Bitcoin. So it's permissioned versus non-permissioned. Anybody can access the Bitcoin chain. Anybody can buy or hold Bitcoin. It's completely independent of the state. It's censorship resistant, whereas a CBDC would be controlled by the Federal Reserve or some type of world Federal Reserve. And, AI governed. So if you're doing anything that doesn't fit within their narrative system of what they want and the behavior they're gearing towards, like you said, you go to pay for your groceries and it's like, nope, until you delete that comment, you're not buying any groceries. Or until you apologize and do a struggle session on Instagram, you're not able to do that. So, you're heading towards a very weird world, for lack of a better term. And I hope it's not. I think Joel and I probably have a similar view of how it could proceed. I think life tends to get very messy in between what is a logical outcome. And, according to the government and the people in power, that logical outcome would be everybody submits to that and everybody is just a good citizen and everybody benefits under this system. The reality is it's digital slavery and you're living in a complete surveillance state panopticon that rivals anything in history and is probably 1,000 times worse because we never had the technology to be able to govern all these people at the same time and to control them. It's not even governing it. It's really controlling them. So you're running into a very weird time, but what you do have also is you're going to have some pushback. So this AI, call it job apocalypse that Joel was talking about, where you really don't need a military. I think, within 3 years, 5 years, we'll look back and potentially say, oh, it was barbaric in the old days. People used to die when we fought wars. Right now, if you look at Ukraine, Russia, drones are doing most of the damage. Obviously, they're damaging things where people are in tanks and whatnot, but there will be a time where those tanks are controlled, the planes are controlled. It's robotic, U.S. robotic dogs on the ground fighting these battles. And then the same goes for drivers of trucks, of cars, and of everything else. So you're seeing labor starting to realize that they're in an extinction level situation right here. So, even something as elevated as the writer strike and actor strike in Hollywood, these people are recognizing, hey, we're going to be replaced by AI. We better make our stand now. You're going to see probably truckers and others do the same. But the interesting thing is labor in America has always been a lot more subtle, at least in the last, 50, 75 years. Maybe in the days of Hoffa, there were a lot more actual strife and riots and whatnot. But if you look at Europe still, whether it's the yellow vests or anything else, they riot at the drop of a hat when it comes to cutting pensions or labor or all of their entitlements. So it's going to be interesting to see. And unfortunately, probably the only way, if the unions can't make a stand and try to maintain some power, and I think technology, frankly, is too strong for just unions to make a stand. I think this stuff steamrolls people when people think, do I pay a driver X, or is it basically free at this point except for gas? It's going to be very tough to hold down. You probably run into some violence where people will be bombing or rioting or causing strife in certain areas, whether that's, in Fight Club looks like that, where people are trying to destroy that sort of, that system that holds all of our debt. And we don't have a ton of time, but a debt jubilee is not out of the question if there's a real reset. And we go back to some other type of currency. This is that hybrid stage of it's not going to be a complete government controlling everything. It's not going to be a Bitcoin-centric, decentralized world where people have freedom and it's pure libertarianism and whatnot. There may be a hybrid where the government tries to reboot and say, you know what, we're getting rid of the old dollar. It's the digital dollar. But that digital dollar is backed by a little bit of gold. It's backed by, tiny bit of Bitcoin, but it's backed by our oil, our food. It's backed by hard assets. And that's what you're starting to see in the BRICS and other countries when they're talking about a competing currency. Everybody knows fiat has no real basis other than the size of a military, the legal structure, the political sort of, structure. But to have a real monetary hard-backed currency, you need to use something like gold, which is a Lindy asset that's been around for centuries.
But it's also totally backed by, at the bottom, it's backed by force.
Yep.
Right?
Absolutely.
It's got to be backed by force. And what we're seeing now is, you've mentioned two different sides, right? We have the centralized people. This is the age-old, humans are basically good. We can have a utopia where everybody gets along and everything's fair, which is completely opposite of human nature. We know that. We've seen it forever. Every single day of your life, you can witness it everywhere, that no, people are not basically good. People are basically selfish. And that's when we can get in all of the religious aspects of that. But right now you have the other side, which are what people like to say are the anarchists. I'll call them libertarians. I'll call them people like those of us on the podcast, not very trusting of these centralized things. We want to be able to be free and do our own thing. We want to, sometimes you have to deal with some pain, and that's great because, it has a lot of help for things. So we're going to see, I think, more and more of this split, right? We're going to see this divide between the anarchy side and the centralized side going at each other's throats over every aspect of society. Would you agree with that? Or
yes. And I think hopefully, because again, I know it's just a spiritual holocaust one way if the government wins and you're a permanent slave. I think the most likely with the least amount of pain is perhaps just more of a localism where, you keep fighting back against that one world centralization of power, the extreme federal government that we've seen over the last 50 years, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and more powerful, and have that de-evolution back to true federalism, where the states become the laboratories of experimentation, and even down from states to different cities and towns and municipalities. And they're given really reign to govern as they see fit within maybe a few small rules, but not the, 37,500 page federal regulations and the threat of violence, which really exists for any state now that sort of changes its opinion or doesn't want to allow kids to be mutilated, or doesn't want to, have a certain type of election in their legislature. Like you have these things that if you could just devolve it down, you'd probably get the best of both worlds. It's still going to be messy over the next, decade or so, but at least you have the ability to say, all right, Florida believes in this, Tampa believes in this, I believe in that. That's where I want to go. I'm going to vote with my feet. And if people want to believe in the things that California believes in, then move to California and people can vote with their feet.
Which is why they're trying to say, like the Supreme Court has been moving in that direction. And currently it's a pretty decent setup. So they got rid of Roe v. Wade. What do we see? The other side is basically saying we need to expand the Supreme Court. Yeah. We have to change the whole nature of the Supreme Court because, man, they're moving away from the centralized model to more actual federalism, the way that the writers of the Federalist Papers, for example, laid out, and what our whole system was supposed to be built on. So this war is just going to continue to escalate and escalate and escalate.
But that's a better outcome.
I agree with that.
Than a real hot kinetic war, which is a very big possibility, or a very messy divorce. I'd much rather see, and the bottom is the philosophical outlook of, I think, and this is a generalization, but conservatives, libertarians, spiritual folk, they want to be left alone. They want to be able to practice how they want to practice. They want those core constitutionalist principles of freedom of worship and speech and association. And the left wants to be able to say, our way is the right way. And if you're not doing it our way, then we have to punish you or change you or restrict you. And that's almost an impossible, that doesn't coalesce, those two things. So the easiest way to get towards the first outlook is really to bankrupt the federal government and just, stop devolving power to them, have states start to make, real moves to distance themselves and govern themselves as they see fit. And eventually, I hope it's a much more looser federation of states than the real control and command that we have right now.
Well, dear listeners, the reason why we wanted to bring Mike on to have some of this conversation is partly so that you can hear it from somebody who has respectable credentials and is up to his neck in this stuff every day at very high levels, and has the background and the education and the experience to be able to say these things with some degree of authority and education. This is not the ranting undergrad student who thinks he has some ideas. This is somebody who's lived through these things, understands the systems, has managed the money, has worked in the law firms, and has worked very closely with a lot of the high level people who operate these systems or who see how these systems operate. So Michael, speaking from a position of experience and to some degree authority in terms of knowing what he's talking about. And that way, when you hear somebody say, hey, I'm concerned about the possibility of consolidating government on a global scale, it's probably best not to roll your eyes and say, oh, that could never happen. Because what we're trying to tell you is it is happening. It's happening in very real and practical ways. That doesn't mean that the outcome is a given. It doesn't mean it has to get as messy as some people say it will. But we do need to be aware of the realities of what's going on out there, and aware that some of the hallowed systems that we've been told our whole lives are so dependable and so beyond corruption and are set up so perfectly. It's not really what we're dealing with anymore. That's not really the case. There are many, many cracks and many, many issues. And it's extremely unlikely that there's going to be a clean and healthy way that everybody can stand around and clap and then sing Kumbaya together. That's probably not where we're headed.
It also means don't sit on your butt and do
Right.
nothing.
And that's
Like
where I wanted
conservatives have done for years. We just
Yeah.
kind of like, oh, it'll pass. These guys are crazy. They'll go away. And it turns out, no, that's
We're-
not what's
we're
happening. What's
moving one
happening is
particular direction.
that's right. You need to pay attention and actually get involved in some of these things.
And you've heard me say it before, Brian, since you brought up the Supreme Court. My prediction is the Supreme Court is being systematically dismantled in the public eye, and that's why we're getting all the ugly stories that we're getting. I think it's being prepared to be thrown under the proverbial bus and replaced with, and I say this sarcastically, a new and better system that everybody can agree on and can hit all the moral high ground. So, Mike, I want to give you a chance here to just speak to our listeners are young families. These are people who have kids that are in school. And in my case, I've got kids that are going to be making education decisions in the next few years. Where do they go to school? What do they study? What do they do? And you have people with their 401k and their IRA, and they're looking at it and going, wow, the number's never been bigger. And yet I'm worried about being able to buy the next family car because I can't get a family car for under $90,000 anymore. What's going on? And I just want to kind of give you a chance to tell people, what do you do? What do you think about? Where should our hope and our expectation be? What's the plan? Can this generation, the millennials and beyond, can we weather what's coming up? Is there a way through? Are things going to be okay, or does everybody need to hunker down and buy guns and ammo and bear spray and a bunch of chickens in their backyard? And I say that, I've got chickens in my backyard. So, just share some thoughts on that. What is the average person who says, I don't understand what this, I don't really know what the Federal Reserve is. I don't understand what fiat currency means. I know there's a problem with the dollar and I'm worried about my employment. And by the way, I can see that society seems to be heading towards some tension here. What do I do?
Yeah. And those are great questions and really all that matters. So I think there are certain things you can do, and it's critical, first of all, in this time, especially with the media, that if it bleeds, it leads, and is constantly gaslighting you left and right of things that aren't true, to maintain that faith and hope and optimism. So I think the best thing you could possibly do is, and the way I coach on it, is almost like a concentric circle. And if you think about multiple concentric circles, the stuff right next to you is you. You're at the center of it, your relationship with God, with your family, and the people very close to you. And and then you expand out to your close friends and then your community, and it goes farther and farther. The mistake most people make is that they worry about the most outer ring. They're worried about what's happening in Russia. They're worried about, Joe Biden as president, and things that they have very little control over.
Are you saying that Trump's charges are not the single most important thing to my day-to-day life right now?
No. They're important. I mean, I don't think you want to completely dismiss it because it's just a tell. It's a signal of the power structure that's trying to close again and get rid of many different people who are fighting against it, or close off your freedom. But you can't control that. What you do on a day-to-day basis has no bearing on that. What you can do on a day-to-day basis is improve your own resilience, your own sovereignty, improve your family, improve the time you spend with them, start thinking about redundancy, meaning, if you have a job that's likely to be made extinct by AI, start thinking about other jobs that are out there that may be a little bit more recession proof or AI proof. I mean, there are things like welding or using your hands or other jobs, other activities that will last a lot longer than, say, somebody, that could be easily replaced, like data mining or something like that. So keep looking for other things. Prepare yourself and your family for some possible difficult times. And that may mean, build up your emergency store of capital. If you have a 3-month, try to get to a 6-month or a 12-month. It may mean doing some canning or buying some perishable goods to have. It may mean having a water system. The more you can do to be resilient and sovereign and not depend on government, the better off you're going to be. And get active. Get active in local politics. Get active in local community stuff. I mean, those are the things that really affect you. Your school board, how your children are being taught. I mean, I've seen, I live in New York, which is the belly of the beast. So you see how the public schools are run. You see how the government is run. You see how people are put into a straitjacket if they try to defend themselves, like the gentleman Daniel Perry on the subway, who is defending himself, now being charged with murder. So you really have to find your tribe, align with people that think similarly to you, because when it comes down to it, if things get more difficult, you're going to need people to lean on, people that you may be able to help. And the best way you can do that is by making yourselves more resilient and self-sovereign. And then it's also weaponizing your dollar on a bigger scale. So if somebody like Nike is spitting in your face on American principles that you believe in, or Bud Light, or any of those other companies that seem to disregard, normal flag waving Americans, then don't spend any money on them. There are plenty of smaller companies with goods made in America. Perhaps it's a little bit more expensive, but think about what you're financing by buying those goods or not buying them. So weaponize your dollar. Every dollar counts. And then stick with, we're seeing a huge, I think, rebirth right now in awakening and consciousness. I think it's from two different areas. I think it's a rebirth of faith in Christ and of just general spirituality. Some of it may be brought on by psychedelics and that angle, but people are waking up to the nonsense on an everyday basis and realizing what counts. So I do think we're in a struggle that intersects and aligns with, whether it's a fourth turning, whether it's Revelations, you are at the turn of an age. And I do think in the end, the forces of light went out, the forces of good, but it's not going to be easy and it's not going to be smooth, and you have to prepare for it and be ready and stay faithful and keep hope.
Well, thank you. Very wise words indeed. And so listeners, I know this is a little bit different from our typical episode, but I hope you recognize why we're having these conversations. And I want to echo what Mike was saying there at the end. We are at the turning of an age. It might be the turning of the age, but for sure it's a turning of an age. And that means that we have to be extremely careful where we place our hope and where we place our preparation. Your hope cannot be in a political party. Your hope cannot be in a financial system. Your hope cannot be strictly in a certain flag. It can't be in a certain citizenship or a certain passport. Your hope can't be in these man-made principles that are things that you can't necessarily control. Our hope has to be in something that is higher and beyond that. And meanwhile, we have to take responsibility for our own actions. We can't look to a political party to make the changes in lives and hearts and the world that need to be made. We got to start at home with ourselves and say, what do I need to do differently? Because those are the things that we can do. And those are ultimately the things that are going to affect us and affect our resilience as we face challenges and uncertainty. If something that you think can't go away goes away tomorrow, like just say hypothetically, say the electricity goes off for a week. If you don't have an idea of how to handle that, it's time to start thinking about how to handle that. And I'm not saying that you need to lay awake at night paranoid that the electricity is going to go off, but you do need to start taking some level of responsibility for, how do I handle disruptions? How do I handle something that might push me to a state of discomfort? How does my family handle that? Where am I spending my money? Where am I spending my time? Do I need to think about my physical fitness? Do I need to think about my habits? Do I need to think about where we're spending our extra money or extra time? And those kinds of things can really make a big difference when it comes to these sorts of decisions. And then ultimately, here at Mystery Babylon, we're based on biblical principles, and we believe that the Bible is the ultimate authority. And what the Bible tells us is things are going to struggle. There are dark spiritual forces that are actively trying to tear down and cause disruption and cause strife and cause bloodshed and cause division. And I think we're seeing that in very real ways. But at the same time, what Scripture tells us is that those things aren't new. They have been before, and they don't win in the end. So if you really want to know where to put your hope is in Christ, because Christ and his sacrifice on the cross is what defeated the dark spiritual forces. He's the one that at the end, when we look at Scripture, says every knee will bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth. And it's not just talking about human knees or terrestrial knees. Every knee will bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth and say that he wins, that Jesus Christ is Lord. So that's That's the side that you need to be on. And if that's something that you haven't considered and haven't examined in your own life, start there. Say that, okay, I know where this is going to come out. I know in the end, in the long run, whether it's 5 months, 5 years, 500 years, or 5,000 years, I know where this is headed. And I want to be on that side of things. I want to be, I want my loyalty to start first and foremost with Christ. And then you don't have to worry about the rest of this, because guess what? The United States of America isn't going to exist forever. The US dollar is not going to exist forever. China's not going to exist forever. The World Bank, the World Economic Forum, these things are not going to exist forever. Someday your house isn't going to exist, and your children are going to grow up, get old, and die, and so will their children. That's the reality in which we live. That's the human condition. But what are we doing with it? If those things if the fact that those things are going to move on cause so much anxiety and paralysis that we're miserable, then we have the wrong outlook, because the whole point of life is that it matters because our Creator says that it matters, and because things like love and kindness and joy and peace are worth pursuing, and that we can find those things in Christ. And he tells us ultimately that those things are eternal when they're based in him. So we encourage you to examine these things carefully and not have your head in the sand, and also not to be alarmed or terrified when bad things happen or bad things look like they could happen. The point of this episode is not to scare you and not to make you have anxiety or depression, certainly not to make you feel like you need another stiff drink tonight. That's not the point at all. The point is to say, okay, this stuff is going on. This is the reality. So what? Now what? Now what do I do? And the answer is, well, start paying really close attention to what's most important, and don't get distracted by the hand waving and all of the careful engineering of everything else that's trying to get your attention, and try to say that the things that don't matter are where you should be paying attention. So hopefully that's made sense. We really want to thank our friend Michael Kimelman. We will link to his content and some of these things. Michael, I'll give you the last minute here for any closing thoughts. Tell people where to find you, what to look for, anything that you want people to know about you or what you're up to these days. And then we'll end the recording, and we look forward to seeing what you're up to next.
I appreciate it, Joel, Brian, and Dan. And that was a terrific summation, Joel. I thought it was really poignant and tells you everything you need to know. You got to control what you can control and put the rest of it in faith in a higher power. And I think that's a really powerful message. But that means the stuff you can control, like your fitness, like your spending and your health and your family, you have to control and take power and make something happen there, rather than just sitting as a spectator. So I take that to heart every day. What I'm up to now is I'm doing a lot of consulting in the business side, but I also write a weekly newsletter, and that newsletter is called Sovereign Sunday. It's on Substack. I think Joel will link to it. It's a free newsletter. It's basically my analysis of everything that's happening in the world, summed up in a pretty tight little newsletter.
And it's a lot of fun. It's fun. I enjoy reading it. It's a good time.
Thank you. So I do that. I also offer some group coaching and some one-on-one coaching, mostly in the financial space, as well as the personal high performance and peak development space. I can put a link to that if people are interested. And then reach out to me on Twitter or Instagram, Facebook. I'm on all the social media. Try not to spend too much time on it, but I'm there. So if you have any questions, you want to say hi, just reach out to me. I'm happy to respond to anybody and engage. And hopefully, I think you guys, I hope learned something today. I hope you keep your faith and stay positive. I think in the end, the light wins, and everybody on this call will be a big part of that. So thank you guys for having me.
Thanks so much.
And thank you, dear listeners. We are so glad you joined us for this episode, and we look forward to the next episode.